On 21 August 1941, a French communist, Pierre Georges, assassinated the German naval officer Anton Moser in the Paris metro, the first time the resistance had killed a German. 59. The German military governor-general Otto von Stülpnagel had 3 people shot in retaliation, none of whom were connected to his killing. 45. General Stülpnagel announced on 22 August 1941 that for every German killed, he would execute at least 10 innocent French people, and that all Frenchmen in German custody were now hostages. 59. On 30 September 1941, Stülpnagel issued the Code of Hostages, ordering all district chiefs to draw up lists of hostages to be executed in the event of further incidents, with an emphasis on French Jews and people known for communist or Gaullist sympathies. 84. On 20 October 1941, Oberstleutnant Karl Friedrich Hotz, the Feldcommandant of Nantes, was assassinated on the streets of Nantes. The military lawyer Dr. Hans Gottfried Reimers was assassinated in Bordeaux on 21 October. 81. In retaliation, the Wehrmacht shot 50 unconnected French people in Nantes, and announced that if the assassin did not turn himself in by midnight of 23 October, another 50 would be shot. 81. The assassin did not turn himself in, and so another 50 hostages were shot, among them Léon Jost, a former socialist deputy and one-legged veteran of the First World War, who was serving a 3-year prison sentence for helping Jews to escape into Spain. 85. The same day, the Feldcommandant of Bordeaux had 50 French hostages shot in that city in retaliation for Reimers's assassination. 81. The executions in Nantes and Bordeaux started a debate about the morality of assassination that lasted until the end of the occupation. Some French argued that since the Germans were willing to shoot so many innocent people in reprisal for killing only one German that it was not worth it, while others contended that to cease assassinations would prove that the Germans could brutally push the French around in their own country. 81. General de Gaulle went on the BBC's French language service on 23 October to ask that PCF to call in their assassins, saying that killing one German would not change the outcome of the war, and that too many innocent people were being shot by Germans in reprisals. As the PCF did not recognize de Gaulle's authority, the communist assassins continued their work under the slogan, "An eye for an eye." And so, the Germans continued to execute between 50 and 100 French hostages for every one of their number assassinated. 81. As more resistance groups started to appear, it was agreed that more could be achieved by working together than apart. The chief promoter of unification was a former prefect of Chartres, Jean Moulin. 86. After identifying the 3 largest resistance groups in the south of France that he wanted to see cooperate, Moulin went to Britain to seek support. 86. Moulin made a secret trip, visiting Lisbon on 12 September 1941, from whence he traveled to London to meet General de Gaulle on 25 October 1941. 86. De Gaulle named Moulin his representative in France, and ordered him to return and unify all resistance groups and have them recognize the authority of de Gaulle's Free French National Committee in London, which few resistance groups did at the time. 86. To lend further support. In October 1940, de Gaulle founded the BCRA, Bureau Central de Renseignements et d'Action, Central Office for Intelligence and Action, under André Duovrin, who used the code name Colonel Passy, to provide support for the resistance. 48. Though the BCRA was based in an office in Duke Street in London, its relations with the SOE were often strained, as de Gaulle made no secret of his dislike of British support for the resistance groups, which he saw as British meddling in France's domestic affairs. 87. Tensions between Gaullist and non-Gaullist resistance groups led to the SOE dividing its F section in 2, with the RF section providing support for Gaullist groups and the F section dealing with the non-Gaullist groups. 47. British SOE agents parachuted into France to help organize the resistance often complained about what they considered the carelessness of the French groups when it came to security. 88. A favorite tactic of the Gestapo and the Abwehr was to capture a resistant, turn him or her to their side, and then send the double agent to infiltrate the resistance network. 89. Numerous resistance groups were destroyed by such double agents, and the SOE often charged that the poor security arrangements of the French resistance groups left them open to being destroyed by one double agent. 90. For example, the Interallié group was destroyed when Carré was captured and turned by Abwehr Captain Hugo Bleicher on 17 November 1941, as she betrayed everyone. 47. The same month, Colonel Alfred Huetox of the OCM was betrayed by an informer and arrested by the Gestapo. In November 1941, Freinet recruited Jacques Renouvin, whom he called an experienced brawler, to lead the new group's Franks paramilitary arm of the Combat Resistance Group. 91. Renouvin taught his men military tactics at a secret boot camp in the countryside in the south of France, and led the group's Franks in a series of attacks on collaborators in Lyon and Marseille. 91. Freinet and Renouvin wanted to blind and deafen the French police by assassinating informers who were the eyes and ears of the police. 91. Renouvin, who was a known tough guy and experienced killer, personally accompanied resistants on their first assassinations to provide encouragement and advice. 91. If the would-be assassin was unable to take a life, Renouvin would assassinate the informer himself, then berate the would-be assassin for being a sissy, who was not tough enough for the hard, dangerous work of the resistance. 91. On 7 December 1941, the Nacht-und-Nebel decree was signed by Hitler, allowing the German forces to disappear anyone engaged in resistance in Europe into the night and fog. 92. During the war, about 200,000 French citizens were deported to Germany under the Nacht-und-Nebel decree, about 75,000 for being resistants, half of whom did not survive. 92. After Germany declared war on the United States on 11 December 1941, the SOE was joined by the American Office of Strategic Services (OSS) to provide support for the resistance. 47. In December 1941, after the industrialist Jacques Arthuis, the chief of the OCM, was arrested by the Gestapo, who later executed him, leadership of the OCM was assumed by Colonel Alfred Townie of the Deuxem Bureau, which continued to provide intelligence to the Free French leaders in exile in Britain. 48. Under the leadership of Townie, the OCM became one of the Allies' best sources of intelligence in France. 48. 1942. The struggle intensifies. On the night of 2 January 1942, Moulin parachuted into France from a British plane with orders from de Gaulle to unify the resistance and to have all of the resistance accept his authority. 86. On 27 March 1942, the first French Jews were rounded up by the French authorities, sent to the camp at Drancy, then on to Auschwitz to be killed. 93. In April 1942, the PCF created an armed wing of its main d'oeuvre immigré, migrant workforce, representing immigrants called the FT-Pimois under the leadership of Boris Halban, who came from the Bessarabia region, which belonged alternately to either Russia or Romania. 46. On 1 May 1942, May Day, which Vichy France had tried to turn into a Catholic holiday celebrating St. Philip, Premier Pierre Laval was forced to break off his speech when the crowd began to chant "Mort à Laval," death to Laval. 77. As millions of Frenchmen serving in the French army had been taken prisoner by the Germans in 1940, there was a shortage of men in France during the occupation, which explains why Frenchwomen played so a prominent role in the resistance, with the Resistante Germain Tillion later writing, "It was women who kick-started the resistance." In May 1942, speaking before a military court in Lyon, the Resistante Marguerite Gonnet when asked about why she had taken up arms against the Reich, replied, "Quite simply, Colonel, because the men had dropped them." In 1942, the Royal Air Force RAF attempted to bomb the Schneider Kraussat works at Lyon, which was one of France's largest arms factories. 94. The RAF missed the factory and instead killed around 1,000 French civilians. 94. Two Frenchmen serving in the SOE, Raymond Basset, codename Mary, and André Jarret, codename Gauguin, were parachuted in and were able to repeatedly sabotage the local power grid to sharply lower production at the Schneider Kraussat works. 94. Frenne, who had emerged as a leading resistant, recruited the engineer Henry Garnier living in Toulouse to teach French workers at factories producing weapons for the Wehrmacht how best to drastically shorten the lifespan of the Wehrmacht's weapons, usually by making deviations of a few millimeters, which increased strain on the weapons. Such acts of quiet sabotage were almost impossible to detect, which meant no French people would be shot in reprisal. 94. To maintain contact with Britain, resistance leaders crossed the English Channel at night on a boat, made their way via Spain and Portugal, or took a spy taxi, as the British Lysander aircraft were known in France, which landed on secret airfields at night. 73. More commonly, contact with Britain was maintained via radio. 73. The Germans had powerful radio detection stations based in Paris, Brittany, Augsburg, and Nuremberg that could trace an unauthorized radio broadcast to within 16 kilometers, 10 miles of its location. 73. Afterwards, the Germans would send a van with a radio detection equipment to find the radio operator. 95. So radio operators in the resistance were advised not to broadcast from the same location for long. 96. To maintain secrecy, radio operators encrypted their messages using polyalphabetic ciphers. 96. Finally, radio operators had a security key to begin their messages with. If captured and forced to radio Britain under duress, the radio operator would not use the key, which tipped London off that they had been captured. 96. On 29 May 1942, it was announced that all Jews living in the occupied zone had to wear a yellow Star of David with the words Jewif or Juiv at all times by 7 June 1942. 97. Ausby described the purpose of the yellow star, not just to identify but also to humiliate, and it worked. 98. On 14 June 1942, a 12-year-old Jewish boy committed suicide in Paris as his classmates were shunning the boy with the yellow star. 98. As a form of quiet protest, many Jewish veterans started to wear their medals alongside the yellow star, which led the Germans to ban the practice as inappropriate, as it increased sympathy for men who fought and suffered for France. 99. At times, ordinary people would show sympathy for Jews. As a Scot married to a Frenchman, Janet Teissier Ducreux wrote in her diary about a Jewish woman wearing her yellow Star of David going shopping. She came humbly up and stood hesitating on the edge of the pavement. Jews were not allowed to stand in queues. What they were supposed to do I never discovered, but the moment the people in the queue saw her, they signaled to her to join us. Secretly and rapidly, as in the game of Hunt the Slipper, she was passed up till she stood at the head of the queue. I am glad to say that not one voice was raised in protest. The policeman standing near turned his head away, and that she got her cabbage before any of us. 97. By 1942, the Paris commandanter was receiving an average of 1,500 poison pen letters from Corbeau wishing to settle scores, which kept the occupation authorities informed about what was happening in France. 62. One of these Corbeau, a Frenchwoman displaying the typically self-interested motives of her ilk, read, "Since you are taking care of the Jews, and if your campaign is not just a vain word, then have a look at the kind of life led by the girl M.A., formerly a dancer, now living at 41 Boulevard de Strasbourg, not wearing a star. This creature, for whom being Jewish is not enough, debauches the husbands of proper Frenchwomen, and you may well have an idea what she is living off." Defend women against Jewishness. That will be your best publicity, and you will return a French husband to his wife. 63. In the spring of 1942, a committee consisting of SS Hauptsturmführer Theodor Dannecker, the Commissioner for Jewish Affairs Louis Darquier de Pellepoix, and General Secretary of the Police René Bousquet began planning a grand raffle, great roundup, of Jews to deport to the death camps. 100. On the morning of 16 July 1942, the grand raffle began with 9,000 French policemen rounding up the Jews of Paris, leading to some 12,762 Jewish men, women and children being arrested and brought to the Val d'Hiv Sports Stadium, from where they were sent to the Drancy camp and finally Auschwitz. 101. The Grand Raffle was a Franco-German operation. The overwhelming majority of those who arrested the Jews were French policemen. 101. Some 100 Jews warned by friends in the police killed themselves, while 24 Jews were killed resisting arrest. 101. One Jewish Frenchwoman, Madame Rado, who was arrested with her 4 children, noted about the watching bystanders. Their expressions were empty, apparently indifferent. 102. When taken with the other Jews to the place Voltaire, one woman was heard to shout, "Well done! Well done!" while the man standing to her warned her after them, "It'll be us. Poor people." 102. Rado survived Auschwitz, but her 4 children were killed in the gas chambers. 102. Cardinal Pierre-Marie Gerlier of Lyon, a staunch anti-Semite who had supported Vichy's efforts to solve the Jewish question in France, opposed the raffles of Jews, arguing in a sermon that the final solution was taking things too far. He felt it better to convert Jews to Roman Catholicism. 102. Archbishop Jules Gérard Saliège of Toulouse, in a pastoral letter of 23 August 1942, declared, "You cannot do whatever you wish against these men, against these women, against these fathers and mothers. They are part of mankind. They are our brothers." 71. Pastor Mark Bogner, president of the National Protestant Federation, denounced the raffles in a sermon in September 1942, asking Calvinists to hide Jews. 71. A number of Catholic and Calvinist schools and organizations such as the Jesuit Pierre Georges l'Amitié Chrétienne took in Jewish children and passed them off as Christian. 71. Many Protestant families with memories of their own persecution had already begun to hide Jews. And after the summer of 1942, the Catholic Church, which until then had been broadly supportive of Vichy's anti-Semitic laws, began to condemn anti-Semitism and organized efforts to hide Jews. 71. The official story was that the Jews were being resettled in the East, being moved to a Jewish homeland somewhere in Eastern Europe. 102. As the year continued, the fact that no one knew precisely where this Jewish homeland was, together with the fact that those sent to be resettled were never heard from again, led more and more people to suspect that rumors of the Jews being exterminated were true. 102. Ausby argued that, given the widespread belief that the Jews in France were mostly illegal immigrants from Eastern Europe who ought to be sent back to where they came from, it was remarkable that so many ordinary people were prepared to attempt to save them. 71. Perhaps the most remarkable example was the effort of the Calvinist couple André and Magda Tréquemet, who brought together an entire commune, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, to save between 800 and 1,000 Jews. 103. The Jews in France, whether they were Israelites or immigrant Juifs, had begun the occupation discouraged and isolated, cut off and forced to become absent from the places they lived in. Now, as the threat of absence became brutally literal, their choices were more sharply defined, more urgent even than for other people in France. As an example of the differing fates open to French Jews from 1942 onward, Ausby used the 3-part dedication to the memoir Jacques Adler wrote in 1985. The first part dedicated to his father, who was killed at Auschwitz in 1942. The second to the French family who sheltered his mother and sister, who survived the occupation. and the third to the members of the Jewish resistance group Adler, joined later in 1942-71. As in World War I and the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans argued that those engaging in resistance were bandits and terrorists, maintaining that all Franc-Styrers were engaging in illegal warfare, and therefore had no rights. 96. On 5 August 1942, 3 Romanians belonging to the FT Pimois tossed grenades into a group of Luftwaffe men watching a football game at the Jean Bouin Stadium in Paris, killing 8 and wounding 13. 104. The Germans claimed 3 were killed and 42 wounded. This let them execute more hostages, as Field Marshal Hugo Sparrow demanded 3 hostages be shot for every dead German and 2 for each of the wounded. 105. The Germans did not have that many hostages in custody, and settled for executing 88 people on 11 August 1942. 105. The majority of those shot were communists or relatives of communists. Along with the father and father-in-law of Pierre Georges and the brother of the communist leader Maurice Thorez. 105. A number were Belgian, Dutch, and Hungarian immigrants to France. All went before the firing squad singing the French national anthem or shouting Vive la France, a testament to how even the communists by 1942 saw themselves as fighting for France as much as for world revolution. 105. Torture of captured resistants was routine. 96 methods of torture included beatings, shackling, being suspended from the ceiling, being burned with a blowtorch, allowing dogs to attack the prisoner, being lashed with ox-hide whips, being hit with a hammer or having heads placed in a vise, and the baignoire, whereby the victim was forced into a tub of freezing water and held nearly to the point of drowning. A process repeated for hours. 106. A common threat to a captured resistant was to have a loved one arrested or a female relative or lover sent to the Wehrmacht field brothels. 106. The vast majority of those tortured talked. 106. At least 40,000 French died in such prisons. 106. The only way to avoid torture was to be turned, with the Germans having a particular interest in turning radio operators who could compromise an entire resistance network. 96 captured resistants were held in filthy, overcrowded prisons full of lice and fleas, and fed substandard food or held in solitary confinement. 96. On 1 December 1942, a new resistance group, the ORA, Organisation de Résistance de l'Armée, Army Resistance Organization, was founded. 48. The ORA was headed by General Aubert Freire and recognized General Henry Giraud as France's leader. 48. For a time in 1940–1943, there were 2 rival leaders of the Free French movement in exile: General Giraud, backed by the United States, and General de Gaulle, backed by Great Britain. 48. For these reasons, the ORA had bad relations with the Gaullist resistance while being favored by the OSS, as the Americans did not want de Gaulle as France's post-war leader. 48. By the end of 1942, there were 278 sabotage actions in France versus 168 Anglo-American bombings in France. 82. 1943, a mass movement emerges. On 26 January 1943, Moulin persuaded the 3 main resistance groups in the south of France, Franc-Tireur, Liberation and Combat, to unite as the MUR, Mouvements Unis de Résistance or United Resistance Movement, whose armed wing was the AS, Armée Secrète or Secret Army. 107. The MUR recognized General de Gaulle as the leader of France and selected General Charles d'Elestrant, codenamed Vidal, as the commander of the AS. 107. Moulin followed this success by contacting resistance groups in the north such as Ceux de la Résistance, Ceux de la Libération, Comité de Coordination de Zone Nord, and Liberation Nord to ask clarification needed to join. 108. Reflecting the growth of the resistance, on 30 January 1943, the milice was created to hunt down the resistance. although initially that was only one of the militia's tasks. It was first presented as an organization to crack down on the black market. 109 The milice, commanded by Joseph Darnand, was a mixture of fascists, gangsters, and adventurers, with a sprinkling of the respectable bourgeoisie and even the disaffected aristocracy, committed to fight to the death against the Jews, communists, Freemasons, and Gaullists. The oath of those who joined required to them to commit to work for the destruction in France of the Jewish leprosy, the Gaullists and the Communists. 109 The milice had 29,000 members, of whom 1,000 belonged to the elite Franks Guards and wore a uniform of khaki shirts, black berets, black ties, blue trousers, and blue jackets. Their symbol was the white gamma, the zodiacal sign of the ram, symbolizing renewal and power. 110. The Germans did not want any of the French to be armed, even collaborators, and initially refused to provide the milice with weapons. 111. On 16 February 1943, the Service du Travail Obligatoire (STO) organization was created, requiring able-bodied Frenchmen to work in Germany. 75. In the Reich, with so many men called up for service with the Wehrmacht and the Nazi regime reluctant to have German women work in factories, Hitler believed working damaged a woman's womb. The German state brought foreign workers to Germany to replace the men serving in the Wehrmacht. At the Dora works near the Buchenwald concentration camp, about 10,000 slave workers, mostly French and Russian, built V-2 rockets in a vast subterranean factory. They lived in quarters meant to house only 2,500, were allowed to sleep only 4.5 hours every night, and were regularly brutalized by the guards. 112. The chief pleasure of the slaves was urinating on the machinery when the guards were not looking. 112. The underground press gave much coverage to the conditions at the Dora works, pointing out those Frenchmen who went to work in Germany were not paid the generous wages promised by the organization taught, and instead were turned into slaves, all of which the underground papers used as reasons for why the French should not go to work in Germany. 112. Under the law of 16 February 1943, all able-bodied Frenchmen aged 20-22 who were not minors, farmers or university students had to report to the STO to do 2 years' labor in Germany. 113. As the occupation went on, service with the STO was widened, with farmers and university students losing their exempt status until 1944, when all fit men aged 1860 and women aged 1845 were being called up for service with the STO. 113. Men over 45 and women serving in the STO were guaranteed not to go to Germany, and many were put to work building the Atlantic Wall for the organization taught, but had no way of knowing where they would go. 113. The so-called réfractaires attempted to avoid being called up and often went into hiding rather work for the Reich. 114. At least 40,000 Frenchmen, 80% of the resistance were people under 30, fled to the countryside, becoming the core of the Maquis guerrillas. 75. They rejected the term réfractaire with its connotations of laziness and called themselves the Maquis, which originated as Corsican Italian slang for bandits, whose root word was macchia, the term for the scrubland and forests of Corsica. 115. Those who lived in the macchia of Corsica were usually bandits, and those men fleeing to the countryside chose the term Maquis as a more romantic and defiant term than réfractaire. 115. By June 1943, the term Maquis, which had been a little-known word borrowed from the Corsican dialect of Italian at the beginning of 1943, became known all over France. 115. It was only in 1943 that guerrilla warfare emerged in France as opposed to the more sporadic attacks against the Germans that had continued since the summer of 1941, and the resistance changed from an urban movement to a rural movement, most active in central and southern France. 116. Fritz Sauckel, the general plenipotentiary for labor deployment and the man in charge of bringing slaves to German factories, demanded the flight of young men to the countryside be stopped and called the Maquis terrorists. Bandits and criminals, 117. One of every two French people called to serve in the SDO failed to do so. 118. Sokol had been ordered by Hitler in February 1943 to produce 500,000 workers from France for German industry by March. And it was he who had pressured Laval to create the SDO with the law of 16 February 1943. 113. Sokol had joined the NSDAP in 1923, making him an Alter-Kämpfer old fighter, and like many other Alt-Kämpfer, who tended to be the most extreme Nazis, Sokol was a hard man. Despite warnings from Laval, Sokol took the view that he was ordered by Albert Speer to produce a quota of slaves for German industry, that the men joining the Maquis were sabotaging German industry by fleeing to the countryside, and the solution was simply to kill them all. 119. Sokol believed that once the Maquis were wiped out, Frenchmen would obediently report to the SDO and go to work in Germany. When Laval was presented with Sokol's latest demand for French labor for German industry, he remarked, "Have you been sent by de Gaulle?" 120. Laval argued the réfractaires were not political opponents and should not be treated as such, arguing that an amnesty and a promise that the réfractaires would not be sent as slaves to Germany would nip the budding Maquis movement. 119. As Laval predicted, the hardline policies that Sokol advocated turned the basically apolitical Maquis political, driving them straight into the resistance, as the Maquisards turned to the established resistance groups to ask for arms and training. 119. Sokol decided that if Frenchmen would not report to the SDO, he would have the Tat organization use the Shanghaiing, storming into cinemas to arrest the patrons or raiding villages in search of bodies to turn into slaves to meet the quotas. 120. Otto Abetz, the Francophile German ambassador to Vichy, had warned that Sokol was driving the Maquis into the resistance with his hardline policies, and joked to Sokol that the Maquis should put up a statue of him with the inscription, "To our #1 recruitment agent." 120. The French called Sokol the slave trader. 118. Furthermore, as Laval warned, the scale of the problem was beyond Vichy's means to solve. The prefects of the departments of the Lozère, the Hérault, the Aude, the Pyrénées-Orientales and Aveyron had been given a list of 853 réfractaires to arrest, and managed during the next 4 months to arrest only one réfractaire. 119. After the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended with the destruction of the entire German Sixth Army in February 1943, many had started to doubt the inevitability of an Axis victory, and most French gendarmes were not willing to hunt down the Maquis, knowing that they might be tried for their actions if the Allies won. 121. Only the men of the group Mobile de Réserve paramilitary police were considered reliable. But the force was too small to hunt down thousands of men. 121. As the Germans preferred to subcontract the work of ruling France to the French while retaining ultimate control, it was the milice that was given the task of destroying the Maquis. 122. The milice was, in Auspy's words, Vichy's only instrument for fighting the Maquis. Entering the popular vocabulary at more or less the same time, the words Maquis and milice together defined the new realities. The one a little-known word for the back country of Corsica, which became a synonym for militant resistance. The other a familiar word meaning simply militia, which became a synonym for militant repression. The Maquis and the milice were enemies thrown up by the final chaos of the occupation, in a sense twins symbiotically linked in a final hunt. 122. The established resistance groups soon made contact with the Maquis, providing them with paramilitary training. 49. Fresnay remembered,